afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending here and attending online. What may be our last event of the year. There might be another one that would just take advantage of an opportunity in a couple of weeks. My name is Anat Admati, and I'm a finance professor here at Stanford Business School, and founder and faculty director of the Corporation Society Initiative, CASI, that's sponsoring this event. In addition to myself and my fellow co-faculty director, Paul Fleider, CASI is led by staff director Lisa Simpson, where's she? Over there, and by a wonderful group of student leaders, one of whom, Tom Newcomb here, is taking the questions from the Zoom audience. CASI focuses on the challenge of ensuring that corporations best serve society. And what we recognize is that what's critical to this pursuit is to get the governance right in all institutions, in the private sector and in government. Effective governance is the opposite of corruption, which is defined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gains. That means that people with power are accountable when their decisions impact others. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, goes the saying. And so secrecy is the enemy of effective governance, and it's a great friend and enabler of corruption. We live in a global world, and in this world, secrecy and dirty money flows is an opaque subject that many prefer not to discuss. We have a very special guest this evening to actually discuss it, so we're so excited to host him. I met Raymond Baker in December 2022 in an international anti-corruption conference in Washington, D.C. I got interested in anti-corruption efforts, and I signed myself to the newsletter of Transparency International, an anti-corruption corporation, where you would get these kinds of email like This Week in Corruption. And they were asking people to propose panels for this anti-corruption conference that for the first time was held in D.C., Washington, D.C., in the USA. And so I decided over the summer to come up with a panel proposal for them, and it was very related to the previous speaker that we had here, Naomi Oreskes, who spoke about the big myth, and she's the author of Merchants of Doubt, which is about climate denialism. And my panel was entitled On the Corruption of Knowledge and What Academics Can Do. And it meant to explore the way in which people confuse other people or confuse the policy or hide certain things or just tell certain narratives, something that I encountered myself in my engagement with policy, and that Naomi Oreskes encountered the same. And I asked, so our panel was not accepted to this conference. It was in that context that I contacted Naomi Oreskes and found out that she had that book forthcoming. And when I went to the conference and I went for a couple of days to just see that crowd in that area. They didn't take my panel, but I wanted to see what this is all about and why they may have not been ready for my panel or whatever. And I asked to meet people who were interested in corruption, including very subtle forms of corruption or the enabling of corruption that comes from developed countries. So they encounter with sort of capitalism, if you wish, the kind of stuff we teach here at the business school. And so among the introductions, the people who were helping me meet the right crowd over there, I was introduced to Raymond, and Raymond gave me an advance copy of the book that we have right there, Invisible Trillions, which I read. This was in December, just a few months ago. And I think Raymond said to me that he is probably the only MBA in this conference, which had thousands of people, and I could assure him that I was the only business school professor in the entire place. So we were both unique in being there at all, coming from this world of business schools, business education. And in our conversation, after giving me the book, he said, do you think business schools are ready to engage in this topic? I said, well, CASI is. So here we are with this event. I also was very happy to discover that Larry Diamond, who's a friend of CASI and an affiliated faculty, and helped us organize a conference on corporations and democracy that we had virtually in December 2020, all available on our website, wrote the preface of this book. And we were fortunate to be able to get Larry to converse with Raymond Baker on this book and on the issues. So I'll give a very brief introduction. I mean, Raymond's bio is like, would take hours. So I will just give you simple highlights. He graduated from that other business school that also Lisa graduated from in the East Coast, Harvard, with an MBA in 1960, where many in the room were were not born or were small children. And he started his career in Africa. So the question is, how did he get to talk about dirty money and all of that? Well, obviously that was more than 60 years ago, so there's many years in between. And in those years, he worked in Africa and Nigeria for 15 years, and this was the start of a lot of global flows, and he started noticing things, and then he started looking into things in the 90s, and wrote a paper entitled The Biggest Loophole in Free Market System in 1999, a paper, and later in 2005, a book called, and the other things about dirty money, the book entitled Capitalism's Achilles Heel, Dirty Money and How to Renew Free Market System. So we talked last time about the big myth of free markets, and he is now talking about it here. So he founded also right after the Global Financial Integrity, a nonprofit in DC, and on the board of Transparency International, etc. So this book appeared just a few months ago, like in January, February of 2023. And anyway, I'm going to stop here. He got a MacArthur Foundation grant. He traveled lots of countries. I can't possibly go through all of this. Larry Diamond has very fancy titles. I'll keep that one short too, because that one's also very long. William Clayton, Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution. Baker, I don't know how to pronounce it, Senior Fellow at Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute, where he has multiple programs that he's directing. He's all over the place, writing books and editing books about democracy, Journal of Democracy founder, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote a book called Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. So I am going to let the two of them take it from here. Larry will converse with him, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Thank you.
I could have, and I probably should have, extended the subtitle to include complacency about the system of financial secrecy and what it's doing to undermine both capitalism and democracy, though, as Raymond knows, I do have a chapter in my book about kleptocracy. But I just want to say this is the book on the subject, and it is both a lucid and extremely readable, in fact, I would say at times gripping, analysis of the problem, highly accessible, and very constructive. It's got a lot of, in addition to an orienting posture, as you'll hear, it's got a lot of very specific ideas on what we need to do. And I think to understand the problem, you need to understand it at 30,000 feet, which is hopefully the opening of what we're going to talk about. And then you need to understand that a lot of the devil is in the details. So Raymond, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for coming here. You want to begin by just making a few opening remarks, including telling us how you got into this experience and how this book evolved from your last book in 2005?
Thank you, Larry. The first thing I want to do is to thank you for writing the foreword of my book. I don't know how many of you know this gentleman's nickname. It is Mr. Democracy. He was recognized by the National Endowment of Democracy last year for his stunning contributions to this. So I'm extremely pleased, Larry, to share this with you again. How did I get into all of this? Yes, I graduated from Harvard Business School in 1960. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I did a couple of things, and then I decided I wanted to get a taste of international business without making any long-range commitment to it, just get a taste. So I sent my resume out to a bunch of corporations, ended up getting 3 offers, one to go to Iran, one to go to Nigeria, and one to go to Brazil. I chose Nigeria because it was a newly independent country. It was English speaking, and I could walk off the plane and manage the entity that I was hired to manage. So I went to Nigeria. And, you know, without any idea of what I was going to be, what I was getting into. But I encountered an old coaster, a British gentleman who had been in West Africa for decades. And he was managing director of a trading company in Nigeria. And I asked him, how do you do business in Africa? And this guy looked me up one side and down the other. He wasn't the least bit forthcoming. I got the impression that he didn't like Americans showing up in his ex-British colony just 1 year after independence. But I pressed on with this guy, and I said to him, okay, well, tell me, how do you price your imported cars and building materials and textiles to sell in the Nigerian market? And the guy looks at me with complete disdain, and he says, price? Price is not a problem. I'm not trying to make a profit. I had just finished Harvard Business School, studying all about how to make a profit, and this guy says, I'm not trying to make a profit. I had no idea what he was talking about. What he was talking about, as I learned later, was transfer pricing. Everything that he imported from the parent company in the UK was overpriced, so that when he sold it in Nigeria, all he had to do was to pay the invoices on what was imported, and the profits were shifted back out of the country. That was the first time I had any concept of this. After settling this into my thinking, I eventually realized that virtually every foreign company operating in Nigeria was doing the same thing. And then I realized that now Nigerians were doing the same thing, using trade for the purpose of shifting money abroad. Move forward now for a little bit. After I'd spent 2 years running that company, I set up on my own and I got married to Pauline, as you know. Yes, and proceeded to starve to death for the first year until I got some consulting contracts and got my feet on the ground a little bit. And then I was hit with the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran conflict. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm playing a zero-sum game here. I'm either going to figure out how to make it, or I'm going to lose my shirt and go back and never admit it. Anyway, so I started buying small and medium-sized companies that I could afford to buy, that other people who were obviously smarter than me were selling out. I bought their companies, made my biggest acquisitions in the Civil War and right as the war was ending, which leads me to another story that I want to tell. The war ended in 1970. I had my eye on a particular manufacturing company that I wanted to buy, and had been following this company for 3 years and was just determined I was going to get my hands on it. This company had lost money every year for 5 years that it had been in business. I offered 10 times book value to buy the company. 2 years later, Harvard Business School wrote a case study on this acquisition, and the case study included the balance sheets and the income statements and the fact that it was nearly bankrupt, having lost money every year that had been created. And the materials talked about the economy of Nigeria, and had just come out of the Civil War and so forth. And the students were asked, should this individual buy this company? I'm sitting in the back of the room. They don't know that it's me sitting back there in that corner. And so the students discussed this case, and then the professor took a vote. How many of you think that this guy should buy this company? 100% of the students said, this is a dog, this is a turkey, don't buy this company, don't even think about buying it. Anybody that would give this any consideration must have been out in the tropical sun too long. So, I was then invited to come down front, just there, and I told the students, not only did we buy it, but we paid off all of its debts in the first year and generous dividends to myself and minority shareholders for years thereafter. How did we do it? Were we management geniuses? No. All we did was buy imported raw materials at world market prices. The other family had been overpricing the import of raw materials for the specific purpose of shifting money out of the country. We didn't do that. We operated it profitably. It turned out to be the most profitable company that I've ever owned. But those two experiences within the first decade of my business career have shaped my approach to this. I have been fascinated for years with the way in which the capitalist system is operating in the shadows, out of sight, in ways that make money for some people and lose money for other people.
Okay, I want to get into that phenomenon in some detail. Before I do, I just have to say, by way of noting the interesting parallel, that the way I got into this issue was also, as you know, by engaging Nigeria and by living there for a year in 1982-83 and watching the politicians of the Second Republic absolutely plunder the country. And it was a much simpler process than the complicated over-invoicing that you've described. The process is very simple. You embezzle the money from the state, or you use some kind of parallel to over-invoicing and extract the wealth from the national treasury, send it abroad, buy property in London, and live like a king. Of course, billions of dollars were drained out of the country that way, and the democracy collapsed in short order. All right, so Raymond, if we could get into the details a little bit now of secrecy capitalism and how it works in the global economy. It's not just over-invoicing within internal corporate trade. You've got a lot of examples here. So can you kind of elaborate on some of the other dimensions of the problem? And then we can get into some other aspects of this.
What I find fascinating and led to my first book and led me to go further in this book is the realization that we in the capitalist system have created an entire financial secrecy system to move and shelter and hide money. This system has a lot of elements. It comprises tax havens. These are places where you can do business and pay no taxes. It comprises secrecy jurisdictions. These are places where you can set up an entity and nobody knows who owns the entities. Disguised corporations are in the tens of millions around the world, where nobody knows who owns the businesses. And incidentally, more of them were created in the United States than in any other countries. Anonymous trust accounts are part of this structure. You can use a trust account to do business. Fake foundations are part of this structure. When you go out and make your first billion, you can establish a charitable foundation. You can donate your money to your charitable foundation, and you can designate yourself as the beneficiary of the charity of your foundation. paying no taxes along the way. Then in making this system work, we in the richer countries, in the United States and Europe and other parts of the world, have left holes in our national laws that enable money to flow through this financial secrecy system and ultimately into our own economies. The United States is the biggest user of the financial secrecy system, and more of that money comes to us than to any other country. A lot of people think, oh, this is Switzerland or this is the UK. No, this is the United States. More of that money flows to us than to any other country. I have been fascinated for years by the degree to which this undercuts the capitalist system, the degree to which it hurts the operations of the capitalist system, and as we can get into further, Larry, other things besides the capitalist system.
Right. So it's a kind of underground or beneath the surface and, well, I would say very perverted form of capitalism. But in order for these people around the world to find the holes in the system, you argue, I think quite convincingly, and to register their anonymous shell corporations, to buy their anonymous real estate, to set up their fake charitable trusts and so on, they need what you call enablers, and indeed an integrated and very comprehensive system of enablers. So could you talk about them?
A lot of people think that corruption and money laundering and tax evasion and all of that are the systems that have been set up to facilitate that have been done by other people. No, every single part of the financial secrecy system that I have just described was created by us in the wealthier Western countries, United States, UK, other parts of Europe and so forth. The entirety of this, and I mean that, not drug dealers, not drug dealers, not criminal syndicates, not human traffickers. None of those people created any of this. We created every single part of the financial secrecy system. You might ask why. The first part of my first book is entitled Illegality, subtitle, We Like the Money. And it's just that simple. We like the money that this system brings into our economies, into the UK, into other wealthier economies. This financial secrecy system that I described is not something that other people have done to us. It is what we have done. This is our creation, every part of it. It's not something done to us, it's something done by us.
So let me ask a question that kind of lurks at the 30,000-foot level. It's almost philosophical or even biological. These individuals who are not drug traffickers and they haven't themselves just stolen money from their national treasury, they're lawyers, they're accountants, they're auditors, they're real estate agents. They think of themselves, I'm sure, as just, making money in a way that is permitted by the system. Can you? I think you've met some of these people. The banks. You understand how they work. Are we talking about? Now, sorry, this is just human nature. Are we talking about the weaker elements of human nature? I mean, how should we think about the motives surrounding this system of participation and enabling?
I wondered for a long time how people can participate in this system and not comprehend the bigger questions of what it was doing. And I finally realized that some of these enablers, bankers and lawyers and accountants and so forth, actually have it in their thinking that money that is locked up in a corrupt country or someplace that is risky or so forth, that money should be brought out and should be put in a safe place where it can grow and generate profits and so forth. So the right thing to do is to take the money out of there and bring it to where it can be safe. This is a pretty self-justifying approach to this, but I have seen that operate a lot of times. There's another aspect to this, Larry, and you have indicated that a lot of these people are just abiding by the law, not necessarily breaking the law. I would make a qualification to that, and that is that the capitalist system has bought and paid for the laws that it wants that make much of this stuff perfectly legal. So, you know, the capitalist system has paid billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to produce the laws that vaguely facilitate this activity. And then, as I said, our legislators, very much influenced by those people who are pouring money into campaign contributions, pass the laws that enable these sorts of things to go on. The fundamental point that I'm making is that that these machinations that take place within the capitalist system, this is our doing. It's not somebody else. And I have stood on platforms and said, let's stop blaming those corrupt countries over there, okay? Let's look at ourselves, because we are the creators of this system. We are the people that have made that have enabled this to go on, and it's the capitalist system buying what it wants and paying the money to the legislators through campaign contributions that are necessary to have what we want. So we've got vast holes in our laws that facilitate this.
Okay, I want to come to those holes and how we fill them in a minute, but I have one more analytical question before we do. You argue, it's a major argument in your book, that there is a deep and inescapable relationship between this system and, frankly, its acceleration in recent decades and deepening inequality as well as eroding democracy. And not just deepening inequality in the countries from which wealth is being extracted and sent back to Britain, the United States, Switzerland, et cetera. I could say a lot more about that in the case of Nigeria and elsewhere, but deepening inequality in our own countries. So what's the link there?
When I graduated from Harvard Business School all those decades ago, 1960, the ratio between executive pay and workers' wages was 20 to 1. That 1960 marked the close of the 15-year period following World War II, which in retrospect, I think was the most responsible period in American capitalism that we've ever had. But beginning in the 1960s, due to some other things that I talk about in my book, beginning in the 1960s, we began to create the financial secrecy system. And what has it done? Among other things, it's driven inequality. That 20 to 1 ratio that existed in 1960 between executive pay and workers' wages, today it's more than 350 to 1. So we're talking about a phenomenon that has driven inequality. And I'm not about to say that it is the sole explanation for inequality, but it is a major driving force in inequality. And the degree of angst that has caused, particularly within American society, is stunning. We could talk more about that. An analysis was done that indicated if the 20-to-1 ratio in 1960 had maintained itself as the U.S. economy grew, and it was still 20-to-1 today, the middle class would be better off by $50 trillion. Every working class American knows, every employee in a major corporation knows that his boss is making tens of millions and he, the worker, is getting 10 cents an hour more in his salary. Everybody knows this disparity has exploded. Think what would have happened if it had not exploded. That's been a major driving factor in inequality, and it's had an enormous impact on democracy, as we may later get into, Larry.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the system of financial secrecy in these various dimensions, enabling and contributing to, not as the sole factor, but a powerful, let's say, accelerant, these shocking intensifications of income and wealth inequality around the world. And that alone, I would say, if you study the literature on democracy, is not very favorable for the future of democracy and is producing a lot of the populist backlash you see, even if it backs some of the creatures of this system, ironically enough. But I want to, in about 7 minutes, get to questions from this audience and our online audience. So in that time, you've got, half a book here of ideas about how to reform and fix the system. And it really involves plugging a lot of holes, and I'd say meeting the devil in the details. So can you share some of your kind of reform priorities with us?
Yes, and let me precede that a little bit. After my first book was published, we formed an organization called Global Financial Integrity in order to very optimistically try to influence global financial integrity. A lot of other organizations were also formed, and we've all been dealing with very particular aspects of the problem that I'm addressing. We're dealing with human trafficking. We're dealing with organ sales. We're dealing with corruption. We're dealing with money laundering issues. All of us are dealing with particularistic aspects of this. And what I finally realized several years ago is that we've got to elevate this to a higher level. We've got to take our particularistic concerns and say, we are in fact dealing with a problem that is much more fundamental than just the particular details. I was influenced in coming to this realization by the way the climate change issue moved. Scientists and experts knew in the 1970s and 80s and 90s that global warming was a reality, but this had not gotten into the global consciousness. It was in scholarly papers and among the experts and so forth. But finally along comes Al Gore, and Al Gore, through his speeches and films and presentations and Oscar Award and Nobel Peace Prize and so forth, he drove this issue into the global consciousness. That's what has to happen. What I'm talking about has to get into the global consciousness. I wish I had the stature that Al Gore, I could make more progress in this. But we've got to elevate these concerns to the level that they get into the Overton window, into the window of comprehension, into the window of understanding that this is a huge threat to the democratic capitalist system. Does that answer your question?
it is the prelude to answering my question, or the overarching dimension to it. And I will just add to that. Well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, this man, he's not an academic, okay? He's not some kind of rosy-tinted, political scientist or sociologist who's spent his lifetime in the academy. You're looking at a businessman who has made it clear to you he has run companies, he has bought companies, and I think it's fair to say you've enjoyed making a profit, right?
Yes.
When you have. And there's
profit.
there's a growing number of businessmen, some of them even more spectacularly successful than you, we know who they are, who are really worried, deeply worried about the trajectory we're on. People like Warren Buffett, for example, that this level of inequality and this level of shirking of responsibility, you talk, of course, about spiriting money out of the country so people can evade, among other things, paying the income tax they know, and the impoverishment and decapacitation of the IRS so that they won't be audited. This is not sustainable. That's a major theme of this book. And I also refer you to Martin Wolf's new book, and particularly the title, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. That's what we are in now. And the capitalist part is under assault. It's going to be under more focused assault. The democracy part is under assault. It's going to be under more focused assault. And your argument, Wolf's argument, a lot of the growing arguments is the two assaults are intimately interrelated. So in the last kind of 3-4 minutes before we go to questions, give us some of your favorite policy pluggings of the whole. Give us 3 or 4 reforms just as illustration that you think could make a difference here, legislatively or by executive action.
Let me lead into that by continuing your line of discussion for a moment, and then we'll get into how you solve the problem. Capitalism and democracy are the two basic pillars of our system and the systems of many other countries. Capitalism is supposed to offer a fair measure of prosperity to its participants. Democracy is supposed to offer an equal measure of political liberty to its citizens. These two basic tenets should be operating in sync, but they are not. They are becoming decoupled. Capitalism and democracy are becoming decoupled and no longer operating in sync to build prosperity and liberty. This is a huge threat to you going forward. You'll see more of this in the future than I will, but this is a fundamental threat. How do you solve the problem? The big answer is transparency and accountability in the capitalist system. The current reality is that democracy is trying to operate with transparency, and capitalism is determined to operate with secrecy, and these two things are not compatible. They won't work together. You can't have one system operating aspirationally with transparency and the other system operating determinedly in secrecy. They are in conflict, and that conflict is impacting so much of our experiences at this present time. How do you solve the problem? Transparency and accountability. Let's take the issue of disguised corporations, shell companies that we've talked about. More of them, as I said, created in the United States than in any other country. After 9/11, give you an example of how you solve the problem of shell companies. After 9/11, the United States passed the Patriot Act. Patriot Act is controversial in a lot of aspects, but It has an anti-money laundering component in it that is quite strong. Among other things, the Patriot Act addressed the issue of shell banks. I don't talk about shell banks anymore because they've been taken off the table. How did we take shell banks off the table, which were banks that nobody knew who owned them and they operated all over the world? How did we take shell banks off the table? Patriot Act says no U.S. corporation can receive money from a shell bank. It goes on to say no other bank in the world can send money to the United States that it has received from a shell bank. It goes on to make it clear that this applies to wire transfers that might touch a New York City correspondent banking account before flitting off to go somewhere else. With this blanket prohibition against shell banks disappeared from the global financial secrecy system just like that. Gone. No bank in the world was prepared to risk losing its access to the U.S. financial system by dealing with some other shell bank. All it took was a clear-cut prohibition against doing it. You can do the same thing with shell companies if we had the courage to do so. Just make it illegal. You can't receive money from a shell company. Now, Larry, you asked some questions earlier about isn't this complicated regulation? There is no regulation in U.S. law for addressing shell banks. There is no office in the Treasury Department that says, we're going to monitor shell banks around the world. And the reason is because there are no shell banks. We took it off the table just like that. You can take disguised corporations off the table just like that. You can address the issue of falsified trade, that business of misinvoicing trade transactions. You can curtail that. I have recommended to probably a dozen developing countries that I've done, that Global Financial Integrity has worked with. I've recommended that they should adopt a law that says no company, domestic or foreign owned, can utilize trade for the purpose of evading or avoiding VAT taxes, customs duties, income taxes, excise taxes, or any other source of global revenue. Put that into your law, but then go a step further, and that is require that in submitting your annual tax returns or annual accounts, you, the managing director of that entity, have to sign a statement that you have followed that regulation. Put your signature on it. This would curtail a great deal of the centerpiece of the financial secrecy system: trade misinvoicing, falsified trade, transfer pricing. It's all the same stuff. Developing countries should put in law that you can't do this, and then require managing directors to sign that they have complied by that. It won't end it altogether. No law will end anything altogether, but it will certainly curtail it. And that's the big thing that I want to do. Banks receive money from abroad. They don't necessarily have to know where it comes from. But banks want to bend over backwards to facilitate the free exchange of money. Well, it has gotten to the point that banks, if they see dirty money, they are expected to file a currency transaction report or a suspicious transaction report. And you would think that this just happens only occasionally. They see this kind of money, and they have to file these kinds of reports. Can you imagine how many suspicious activities reports and currency transaction reports are filed? On average, 80,000 a day. What I'm saying is that U.S. banks will take every dollar of money that comes across the transom, provided they can come up with some flimsy excuse for doing so, and then simply file a report with the U.S. Financial Intelligence Agency. This is unworkable. Banks should have to be, the beginning point is banks should know where the money is coming from. Who are the beneficial owners of those entities that are sending money here? If I was a banker, I wouldn't do business with whom I didn't know who I was doing business with. I would see to it that I knew with whom I was doing business. This is not rocket science. This is entirely a matter of political will. A lot of bankers will say, oh, no, this stuff is terribly complicated. You don't understand how complicated it is. Nonsense. It's terribly simple if you have the will to do it. This is entirely a matter of political will. It is not a matter of complications. The solution to these problems are greater transparency and accountability in financial matters. Give you just one more example addressing the question of inequality. I think it's time to put workers on corporate boards of directors. This disparity between rich and poor is a threatening problem. We've gotten to the point globally, and very close to this point. I won't say quite that. Globally, we've gotten to the point that the richest 1% has wealth comparable to the remaining 99%. Wealth of the richest 1% comparable to the remaining 99%. Inequality has exploded in the United States. One of the easy ways to address that problem is put workers on boards of directors. Elizabeth Warren has said she'd like to see 40% of boards comprised of workers. I don't know where the right percentage is, but get the voice there on the board of directors. That you getting a $10 million raise and me getting a 10-cent an hour raise, that isn't going to continue to work. We have to change this.
All right,
lots of things that can be done in the realm of transparency and accountability to address these issues.
I was going to say it's a very rich menu, but I don't think that's the right adjective. So let's go to Q&A right now. And you got a question from online, Tom, or?
Sure. I'd love to ask a question for online. The online audience thanks you for being here, as well as the in-person audience. We really appreciate it. We agree with a lot of what you're saying. We agree that there's plugs or holes that need to be plugged, that often transparency is the best medicine. But there is a little bit of pushback that enforcement is in fact required. And an example of this might be regulation with laborers and Uyghur or outbound versus inbound CFIUS regimes. So do you think that enforcement is in fact required after regulation, and to what extent?
Oh yeah, I'm all in favor of enforcement. I'm in favor of the regulations and the adequate enforcement. I think part of the reason that Silicon Valley Bank failed was a lack of enforcement of regulations that were in place. But let me make a larger point. Transparency can do more than regulation. I just indicated the example of signing your name on the accounts that you file. Give me transparency, and it takes the place of a lot of regulation. I'm arguing for greater transparency, and it's not synonymous with greater regulation. On the contrary, transparency can make transparency can lessen the need for regulation. The example I gave you of getting shell banks on the table. There is no regulation trying to get, of following the activities of shell banks because they're gone. There's no enforcement, there's no regulation. We outlaw them, they're gone. You can do the same thing with a lot of the aspects of what I'm talking about. Sure, we're always going to have regulation and enforcement issues, but those demands are lessened in a system that operates with transparency and accountability.
Anat, did you want to ask?
Yeah, I do have, on the enforcement issue, in fact. So, there's a lot of faking that's possible these days. So even with transparency, what does, a signature mean? Somebody has to check it. So, the beneficial owner's requirement now is only to the extent that they passed a little bit of it recently, but not implemented yet in the U.S., maybe. Still doesn't have the apparatus to really make it work. So I do think that, I'm not sure how that worked, that the shell banks disappeared, because there must have been some sanction attached to the ones that break that rule, because oftentimes there's no enforcement, people just break it.
You're asking how shell banks disappeared?
But, for example, there must have been some punishment attached to
The punishment attached is that if we find you're doing it, you lose your access to the U.S. financial system.
So they have to believe that you might find it.
But my point is there's no follow-up regulation because nobody is prepared to take that risk.
There has to be a chance that you can discover it.
Yeah. Let me go a step further with this business of shell companies and how to address that problem. I'm in favor of every country having a digitally and publicly available company registry where every company's ownership is understood, is known, and that information is available digitally and publicly. Give me that. This business of the United States having created millions, tens of millions of disguised entities is perfectly ridiculous. Here we are in the state of California. Why is the state of California doing something in secret that you don't know about and you can't find out about? I live in Maryland. After Delaware created the opportunity for disguised entities, are you aware that every other state in the United States followed suit? Every other state in the United States followed suit to enable companies to be established so that you can't find out who owns that company. That's ridiculous. You ought to be able, for the state to do something in your name and you can't find out about it, there's no justification for that. Now, at the federal level, you got secret agents that have to do their stuff in secret. But that's not true at the state level.
But we're not there yet, and in the EU, they just struck down a law that required registry. So we're not there.
Who is they who struck it down?
A
European
European
court?
court. A European court.
European court struck down the efforts in Europe to establish publicly available beneficiary registries on the notion that it was an attack on privacy. And my answer to that, and I make it very clear at the beginning of my book, my answer to that is there's a difference between privacy and secrecy. I'd like my bank account to remain private, but that doesn't mean secret. If somebody with a name similar to mine is accused of a terrorist act and appropriate authorities need to look at bank account information, go right ahead. My privacy is not above your security, your personal security. So I'm really upset with the court in Europe and also with the slow movement of establishing the regulations in the United States. The U.S. laws, the Corporate Transparency Act, will not make that information available publicly. It should be. In the commercial realm, there's no reason for you not to be able to know with whom you're dealing, not to be able to know with what's being authorized on your behalf.
Okay.
I like your statement in which you said transparency is just more important than regulation. So we are doing research in financial technology. So if you theoretically you could make transparent all the payment transactions worldwide, so all the international payments, everything could be transparent. So if you currently maybe also follow the discussion about central banks digital currencies, which are digital currencies issued by central banks, which would allow all the central banks monitoring and tracking on a global basis. Do you think this would be kind of a cure for the financial system, also maybe prevent such fraud and everything? Or do you think that this won't happen in the next time?
That's an interesting question, and the jury is somewhat out as to where this issue goes. Let's draw a distinction between digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are, in fact, a subcategory of the larger definition of digital currencies. Many central banks around the world are thinking about setting up digital currencies. And I don't see anything wrong with this. What it means is you can download to your cell phone money and use that to pay for things. But that's got a large measure of transparency and traceability to it. Cryptocurrencies are an entirely different question. The last time I looked at the number, there were something like 10,000 cryptocurrencies that had been set up around the world. And they vary from the ones that are completely invisible to the ones that have some aspects of securities and are coming under the regulation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Cryptocurrencies that operate completely invisibly, I hope you're not losing your money on these. Yeah, I hope you know. Let's be perfectly clear. Cryptocurrencies that are the most hidden have nothing but narrative value. That is to say, they can be talked up or they can be talked down, but there is no underlying asset that gives that value. So you got to be brave to put a lot of your money into a cryptocurrency, and then in particular to let that get put into a cryptocurrency exchange that is operating completely out of sight. You don't have to imagine much that I'm not a fan of cryptocurrencies. Digital currencies, perfectly all right.
Another online question following cryptocurrencies. It seems, again, we got a spicy online audience that likes to push back a little bit, that the Overton window seems to already be open, and people are talking about anonymity, and they want some from themselves. Cryptocurrency, Robinhood, Professor Becky Lester sitting behind me has a forthcoming paper about different kinds of corporate structures being used. Given that's the current zeitgeist, can you talk about some non-market players, unions, religion, the press, that are also sort of feeding this?
That are also in the crypto space?
That are also sort of exacerbating this problem of invisible money, invisible capitalism.
Well, you go back to the financial secrecy system. Go back to the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. There were an awful lot of pension funds and religious organizations, both in the United States and abroad, that just lapped up these mortgage-backed securities in the in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and they lost. So, you know, to me, the short answer is know what you're putting your money into. Have some understanding of it. I read the story about one woman who had lost her $500,000 life savings in the collapse of FTX, Samuel Bankman-Fried's entity. Why would you take your life savings and put them in an asset that has no underlying value, and then have that put in an exchange that is operating completely in the dark? To me, it makes no sense. Digital currencies make sense. Crypto doesn't, in my thinking.
And I suppose just to clarify the question, even outside of cryptocurrency, is there a role that the press or non-market players might be having in exacerbating the problem of invisible money?
Without question. A lot of hype surrounding cryptocurrencies, a lot of concern that this is, I had a podcast in connection with my book in which the guy said, this is reality, it's here, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, that may be true. There have been a couple of studies of cryptocurrency transactions that indicate that the level of money laundering that is going on is perhaps 50% of cryptocurrency transactions. They're being used for money laundering purposes. That's not healthy for the capitalist system.
I think that sounds like a good warning on which to conclude. Let me just make two substantive points and then a procedural point. The substantive points are that if the need is in part for transparency, the media is obviously a very important part of the solution. And there is some reference to that in here, and the role of the, what is it, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which revealed the Panama Papers and a lot of the money laundering and so on and so forth. So I see independent media, as I know you do, Raymond, as a big part of the solution here in the quest for transparency. And then just ratcheting it up one more level, I will quote, with the slight change in pronouns, our most important constitutional framer, James Madison: if people were angels, we would have no need of government. People are not angels. It's, you know, unless you want to do, a genetic fix of the human species, and God knows where that would lead. This is part of the problem. We're inclined to war. We're inclined to greed. There's a lot of human defects. And what keeps humanity civil, democratic, inclined toward progress are, if I may say so, democracy, the rule of law, transparency, accountability, and making this kind of deceit and greed not pay, too risky to engage in. So I think that is one way, if I may say so, of framing the vital message of this book. And it turns out we have copies of the book here. I guess that people can, aren't we in a free market system where people have to pay for? Well, I do believe Raymond will sign your book if you want to get one. And so big thanks to Raymond Baker. Big thanks to Anat, Admati, and CASI, and thank you all for coming.